In the year 396 BC, the crystal-clear waters of the Mediterranean witnessed one of the most extraordinary naval battles of antiquity. As the sun rose over the port of Syracuse, the largest Greek city in Sicily, 700 Greek soldiers prepared to face the impossible, to withstand the siege of one of the largest war fleets ever assembled in the ancient world. Syracuse was no ordinary city. It was the beating heart of Greek power in the West, a metropolis that rivaled Athens itself in wealth and influence. Its imposing fortifications embraced Sicily's most strategic natural harbor, a perfect haven for warships and merchant vessels. But on that fateful dawn, those same waters that had brought prosperity would become a battlefield. Dionysius the Elder, tyrant of Syracuse, was a man obsessed with power and military glory. He rose to power through shrewd political maneuvering and promises to protect the city against Carthaginian invaders. But his ambition went far beyond mere defense. He dreamed of transforming Syracuse into the center of an empire that would dominate the entire Western Mediterranean. To achieve this, he needed an invincible navy. For years, Dionysius invested colossal fortunes in building an unprecedented war fleet. His shipyards worked day and night, with the best naval carpenters in the known world building triremes and quadriremes, warships equipped with 3 and 4 rows of oars, veritable machines of maritime destruction. He also innovated by commissioning the first quinqueremes, giants of the seas with 5 rows of oarsmen, capable of crushing any enemy vessel through brute force. But Dionysius's military genius wasn't limited to shipbuilding. He was a born strategist, always 3 steps ahead of his adversaries. While other commanders relied on strength and courage, Dionysius relied on cunning, meticulous preparation, and above all, the ability to transform natural conditions into deadly weapons. He studied ocean currents, prevailing winds, the phases of the moon, and how all of this affected naval operations. For him, the sea was not just a battlefield, it was an ally that needed to be understood and manipulated. The situation that led to the siege of Syracuse had deep roots in the complex power relations of the ancient Mediterranean. Carthage, the great North African power, had long coveted domination of Sicily. Rich in wheat and strategically positioned between the eastern and western Mediterranean, the island was a prize worth any sacrifice. The Carthaginians already controlled the western part of Sicily, but Syracuse, guarding the east, remained a thorn in their side for total domination. Dionysius, realizing the inevitability of conflict, decided to act first. In a series of aggressive campaigns, he attacked Carthaginian positions in Sicily, conquering several cities and expanding his territory. His initial victories were impressive, but they aroused the fury of Carthage. The Carthaginian response came in the form of a massive invasion fleet, carrying thousands of soldiers, war elephants, and siege equipment. The confrontation that was about to take place was not merely a battle between 2 cities or 2 armies. It was a clash of civilizations, of military strategies, of worldviews. On one side, Greek discipline and the tactical genius of Dionysius. On the other, the wealth and virtually unlimited resources of Carthage, one of the most powerful nations of the ancient world. The fate of Sicily, and perhaps of the entire Western Mediterranean, would depend on the outcome of this confrontation. The 700 Greek soldiers defending the port of Syracuse were no ordinary troops. They were veteran hoplites, many of whom had fought for years under Dionysius. They wore traditional bronze armor, carried long spears and round shields decorated with symbols of their families. But more important than their equipment was their morale. They fought not only for a tyrant, but for their homes, their families, their city. Each knew that defeat would mean slavery or death. Victory, on the other hand, would guarantee the freedom of Syracuse and eternal glory for those who defended it. But Dionysius's military genius wasn't limited to shipbuilding. He was a born strategist, always 3 steps ahead of his adversaries. While other commanders relied on strength and courage, Dionysius relied on cunning, meticulous preparation, and above all, the ability to transform natural conditions into deadly weapons. He studied ocean currents, prevailing winds, the phases of the moon, and how all of this affected naval operations. For him, the sea was not just a battlefield. It was an ally that needed to be understood and manipulated. The situation that led to the siege of Syracuse had deep roots in the complex power relations of the ancient Mediterranean. Carthage, the great North African power, had long coveted domination of Sicily. Rich in wheat and strategically positioned between the eastern and western Mediterranean, the island was a prize worth any sacrifice. The Carthaginians already controlled the western part of Sicily, but Syracuse, guarding the east, remained a thorn in their side for total domination. Dionysius, realizing the inevitability of conflict, decided to act first. In a series of aggressive campaigns, he attacked Carthaginian positions in Sicily, conquering several cities and expanding his territory. His initial victories were impressive, but they aroused the fury of Carthage. The Carthaginian response came in the form of a massive invasion fleet, carrying thousands of soldiers, war elephants, and siege equipment. The confrontation that was about to take place was not merely a battle between two cities or two armies. It was a clash of civilizations, of military strategies, of worldviews. On one side, Greek discipline and the tactical genius of Dionysius. On the other, the wealth and virtually unlimited resources of Carthage, one of the most powerful nations of the ancient world. The fate of Sicily, and perhaps of the entire Western Mediterranean, would depend on the outcome of this confrontation. The 700 Greek soldiers defending the port of Syracuse were no ordinary troops. They were veteran hoplites, many of whom had fought for years under Dionysius. They wore traditional bronze armor, carried long spears and round shields decorated with symbols of their families. But more important than their equipment was their morale. They fought not only for a tyrant, but for their homes, their families, their city. Each knew that defeat would mean slavery or death. Victory, on the other hand, would guarantee the freedom of Syracuse and eternal glory for those who defended it. Block 2, 7,000 characters. Dionysius had learned early on that naval victories were rarely won through courage or sheer number of ships. They required meticulous preparation, knowledge of the enemy, and above all, the ability to turn the terrain, or, in this case, the sea, into a tactical advantage. While his spies reported on the movements of the Carthaginian fleet, Dionysius spent weeks devising a plan that would depend on both ingenuity and courage. The port of Syracuse was protected by a relatively narrow entrance, flanked by fortifications on both banks. It was the perfect point for a defense, but it also represented a risk. If the Carthaginian fleet managed to force its way in, the Greeks would be trapped in their own port with no possibility of escape or maneuver. Dionysius needed a plan that would transform this potential weakness into a devastating strength. The approaching Carthaginian fleet was truly intimidating. More than 200 warships cut through the waters toward Syracuse, their sails darkening the horizon. Each trireme carried approximately 200 men, rowers, marines, and archers. The larger ships carried even more. In total, the fleet carried about 40,000 men, a force capable of crushing any resistance through sheer numbers. The Carthaginian commanders, confident in their numerical superiority, were already celebrating victory even before sighting the walls of Syracuse. They had defeated Greek fleets before and saw no reason why this time should be different. Their plan was simple and straightforward: form an impenetrable battle line and advance on the harbor, crushing any resistance through sheer numbers. Once inside the harbor, the Greek ships would be easily captured or sunk, and the city would be forced to surrender. But Dionysius had other plans. He knew he couldn't win in a conventional naval battle. His numbers were far inferior. So he decided to change the rules of the game. If he couldn't win on the open sea, he would make the sea work for him. During the weeks leading up to the arrival of the Carthaginian fleet, Dionysius ordered his men to prepare a deadly surprise. The first part of the plan involved modifying the harbor entrance itself, using large iron chains and tree trunks joined by cables. The Greeks constructed submerged barriers that could be quickly deployed or removed. These barriers were invisible from the surface, but devastating to any ship attempting to pass through them at high speed. The wooden hulls of the Carthaginian triremes would be ripped apart by the hidden structures, causing chaos and confusion at the most critical moment of the attack. But Dionysius didn't stop there. He studied the wind and current patterns affecting the port of Syracuse. He discovered that at certain times of day, especially at dawn, the sea currents flowed in a specific way, creating eddies and areas of more turbulent water near the port entrance. An inexperienced commander could easily lose control of his ship under these conditions. Dionysius decided to use this knowledge to time his counterattack. The second part of the plan was even more audacious. Dionysius ordered his best archers and spearmen to position themselves on the walls flanking the harbor entrance. Their positions were carefully prepared, with barriers and shields that allowed the defenders to fire upon approaching ships while remaining relatively protected from return fire. Piles of arrows and spears were accumulated, along with large pots of flammable oil that could be poured onto enemy ships. But the most crucial element of Dionysius' plan involved his own ships. The 700 Greeks who would defend the harbor would not fight all at once. Instead, they would be divided into smaller groups, each with a specific mission. Some ships would remain hidden in side coves, ready to emerge and attack the flanks of the Carthaginian fleet at the right moment. Others would position themselves just behind the harbor entrance, acting as a last line of defense, should the Carthaginians manage to break through the first barriers. When the Carthaginian fleet finally appeared on the horizon, the defenders of Syracuse felt their throats go dry. They had never seen so many ships together. The unfurled sails covered the sea from end to end, a floating army that seemed impossible to stop. War drums echoed over the waters, marking the rhythm of the oars that propelled the ships toward their destination. On land, women and children prayed in the temples, begging the gods for the salvation of their defenders. Dionysius, standing atop the walls, observed everything with calculating eyes. He had staked everything on this plan. If it failed, Syracuse would fall, and he would likely be executed or exiled. But if it succeeded, his name would be immortalized in history as one of the greatest naval strategists of all time. He took a deep breath, raised his hand, and signaled his men to prepare. The Carthaginian commanders, seeing the small number of Greek ships at the harbor entrance, laughed scornfully. Was this all Syracuse had to offer? A few dozen triremes manned by soldiers who would soon be dead or enslaved. They ordered their fleet to advance in close formation, confident that the sheer force of their initial attack would crush any resistance. Dawn tinged the sky blood red as the Carthaginian fleet launched its attack. The first rows of triremes sped forward, their bronze battering rams cutting through the waves with murderous force. The sound of oars beating in unison echoed like thunder across the water as thousands of men rowed in perfect synchrony, propelling their vessels toward the port of Syracuse. It was a spectacle both magnificent and terrifying. The Greek defenders, positioned on their ships near the harbor entrance, stood firm, their spears raised, their shields forming a gleaming bronze wall under the rising sun. Many were veterans of countless battles, but even they felt the weight of the moment. They were about to face a force 10 times greater than their own. Victory seemed impossible, but Dionysius had promised them something more valuable than life, eternal glory and the salvation of their city. As the first Carthaginian ships approached the harbour entrance. Dionysius's plan began to unfold. The Greeks allowed the enemy vanguard to advance unopposed, drawing them closer. The Carthaginians, interpreting this as hesitation or fear, accelerated even further, eager to reach their prey. This was exactly what Dionysius had hoped for. He allowed the enemy's ambition to turn them into easy targets. Suddenly, at the exact moment when the largest concentration of Carthaginian ships entered the critical zone, Dionysius gave the signal. Groups of Greeks positioned in smaller boats quickly pulled on submerged ropes, raising the barriers of chains and logs that had been prepared for weeks. The structures emerged from the depths, directly in the path of the advancing Carthaginian fleet. Chaos ensued instantly. The first Carthaginian ships, unable to stop or steer in time, violently collided with the hidden barriers. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the water as hulls were ripped apart, oars broken, and men thrown overboard. The ships immediately behind, with no time to react, crashed into the damaged vessels ahead, creating a chaotic mass of tangled boats and screaming men. But that was only the beginning. The moment the Carthaginian formation disintegrated into chaos, Greek archers and spearmen positioned on the walls flanking the harbour entrance opened fire. Thousands of arrows and spears rained down on the immobilized Carthaginian ships. Projectiles pierced sails, went through shields, and found flesh. Men fell in heaps, some wounded, others killed instantly. The decks of the ships were slippery with blood. The Carthaginians tried to return fire, but their archers, positioned on unstable ships under constant attack, could not aim accurately. Furthermore, the Greek walls offered excellent protection to the defenders, while the Carthaginian sailors were completely exposed. It was a one-sided massacre. With each passing minute, more Carthaginians fell, while Greek casualties remained minimal. And then came the most devastating part of Dionysius's plan. Huge cauldrons of flammable oil, which had been heated all night, were poured from the walls onto the Carthaginian ships below. The oil spilled onto the wooden decks, onto the sails, onto the men themselves. Seconds later, lit torches were thrown. The result was infernal. Flames erupted instantly, consuming entire ships in a matter of moments. Men covered in burning oil jumped desperately into the sea, only to discover that the sea itself was beginning to catch fire as the oil spread across the surface. The spectacle of the flames reflecting on the harbour waters created a scene worthy of the worst nightmares. Cries of agony echoed from all sides. Entire ships were consumed by flames, turning into floating piles of ash. Black smoke rose in thick columns, blocking vision and further hindering any attempt at coordination on the part of the Carthaginians. What should have been an easy victory was rapidly turning into a complete disaster. The Carthaginian commanders, watching in horror from their ships in the rear, tried to reorganize their forces. They ordered the ships to retreat, regroup, and attempt a different attack. But Dionysius had foreseen this as well. The moment the Carthaginians began to retreat, the Greek ships that had been hidden inside coves emerged like predators attacking wounded prey. These Greek flanking forces were composed of Dionysius' best crew, experienced sailors who knew every inch of those waters. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable than the heavy Carthaginian triremes, and they used this advantage ruthlessly. They would attack, sink, or set fire to a ship, and then retreat before the Carthaginians could respond effectively. It was guerrilla warfare at sea, and it was working perfectly. The battle, which the Carthaginians had hoped would end in less than an hour with a crushing victory, dragged on all day. With each passing hour, more Carthaginian ships were lost. Some sank, others caught fire, still others were captured by the Greeks. The seas around Syracuse were littered with wreckage, fragments of ships, broken oars, bodies floating in the red-stained waves. It was a scene of destruction that would be remembered for generations. By midday, the situation had become untenable for the Carthaginians. Of a force of over 200 ships, almost a third had been destroyed, captured, or severely damaged. The proud and victorious Carthaginian commanders now faced a bitter reality. They had been tactically outmatched by an enemy that possessed less than a quarter of their numbers. The humiliation was as painful as the material losses. Dionysius, watching from the wall, knew this was the critical moment. The Carthaginians were staggering, but not yet defeated. They still possessed more ships and more men than the Greeks. If given time to reorganize, to develop a new strategy that took Greek tactics into account, they could still turn the battle around. Dionysius could not allow this. He needed to transform the Carthaginian chaos into a complete and irreversible defeat. It was then that Dionysius executed the riskiest part of his plan. He ordered the entire available Greek fleet, all ships that were not damaged or already engaged in combat, to leave port in a massive, coordinated charge. It was a bold gamble. If the Carthaginians managed to reorganize in time and respond forcefully, the Greeks would be annihilated in the open sea, where their tactical advantage vanished. But Dionysius had correctly calculated the enemy's psychological state. The Carthaginians had not expected such an aggressive counterattack. The Greek ships emerged from the harbor like an arrow shot from a bow, their formations perfect, their rowers working in absolute harmony. At the front, the heaviest and best-armed ships formed the spearhead, ready to absorb the first impact of any Carthaginian resistance. Behind them came lighter and faster ships, ready to exploit any gap created by the vanguard. It was a formation that Dionysius had trained his men to execute for months, and now it would be tested in real combat. The Greek charge struck the Carthaginian fleet at its most vulnerable moment. The Carthaginian ships were still trying to reorganize, some rowing in one direction, others in another, without clear coordination. When the Greeks hit them, it was like a hammer shattering glass. The bronze battering rams of the Greek ships pierced the hulls of the Carthaginian triremes, sending them to the bottom in a matter of minutes. The Greeks, with momentum on their side, passed through the Carthaginian lines like a sword through silk. What followed was less a battle and more a hunt. The Greek ships pursued the fleeing Carthaginians, sinking them one by one. The Carthaginian sailors, demoralized and exhausted, offered little resistance. Many simply abandoned their ships, preferring to risk their fate swimming to shore. Rather than face the fury of the Greek warriors, others surrendered, lowering their sails in a sign of submission. But not all Carthaginians fled or surrendered. Among them were true heroes, commanders who refused to accept defeat, sailors who fought to their last breath. One Carthaginian trireme in particular, commanded by a captain whose name has been lost to history, made a final stand worthy of epic songs. Surrounded by 5 Greek ships, she continued fighting, her archers firing until they ran out of arrows, her spearmen throwing until they ran out of spears. When she was finally boarded, her defenders fought on deck with swords, knives, even their bare fists. It took the Greeks almost an hour to completely overwhelm the ship, and when they did, they found only 17 Carthaginians still alive out of an original crew of 200. Dionysius, witnessing this last stand, ordered that the survivors be spared and treated with honor. He understood that courage deserved respect. Regardless of which side one fought on, these men would be kept as prisoners of war, but treated well, and could eventually be exchanged for Greek prisoners held by Carthage. It was both a gesture of magnanimity and a calculated political move. Dionysius wanted the word to spread that he was both a fearsome warrior and a just leader. As the sun began to set on that extraordinary day, the outcome of the battle was clear. The Carthaginian fleet had been destroyed. Of the more than 200 ships that had arrived that morning, confident of victory, less than half managed to escape, and many of those were so damaged they could barely sail. Thousands of Carthaginians had died, drowned or burned alive. Thousands more were being taken prisoner to the dungeons of Syracuse. The Greek losses, by comparison, were almost miraculous. Of the 700 men who had begun the battle, fewer than 100 had died. Some ships had been damaged, but none had been completely destroyed. It was such a complete and overwhelming victory that it seemed almost impossible. And yet there it was, recorded not only in historical accounts, but in the physical evidence of the wreckage floating in the waters around Syracuse. The city erupted in celebration. People who had spent the entire day in prayer, fearing the worst, now rushed into the streets in jubilation. Wine was distributed freely, sacrifices were offered to the gods in gratitude, and Dionysius's name was chanted on every corner. The tyrant had proven himself not only a shrewd leader, but a military genius, capable of defeating far more powerful enemies through intelligence and careful planning. But Dionysius, amidst the celebrations, remained cautious. He knew that Carthage would not accept this defeat easily. They would return, probably with even greater force. This victory had bought time for Syracuse, but it had not ended the war. There would still be many battles ahead, many challenges to overcome, and Dionysius would need all his cunning and skill to ensure that Syracuse remained free and independent. In the days following the battle, Dionysius wasted no time in consolidating his victory. While his city celebrated, he worked tirelessly to strengthen Syracuse's defenses and prepare for the inevitable Carthaginian retaliation. Captured prisoners were put to work rebuilding and reinforcing the city walls. New ships were ordered from the shipyards. Messengers were sent to other Greek cities in Sicily and southern Italy, seeking alliances and support. News of Syracuse's victory spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean world. In Athens, still reeling from its own devastating defeat in the Peloponnesian War, Dionysius's victory was met with joy and relief. It proved that the Greeks were still capable of defeating the barbarians, even when significantly outnumbered. Philosophers and historians began to study the battle, analyzing the tactics employed and drawing lessons that would be taught in military academies. For centuries, in Carthage, the reception was quite different. The news of the destruction of their fleet was met with shock and fury. The Carthaginian Senate, meeting in emergency session, debated furiously how to respond. Some argued for an immediate and massive invasion of Sicily, with unlimited resources dedicated to the complete destruction of Syracuse. Others, more cautious, advised a more strategic approach, first building a new fleet and waiting for the right moment to attack. What made Dionysius' victory even more remarkable was that it didn't depend solely on luck or favorable circumstances, although both certainly played a role. It was a victory built on meticulous preparation, deep knowledge of the terrain and the enemy, and above all, on the ability to think unconventionally. Dionysius didn't try to beat the Carthaginians at their own game. Instead, he changed the rules, transforming Carthaginian advantages, their superior numbers and their confidence, into disadvantages. The tactic of using submerged barriers was brilliant in its simplicity. It required no advanced technology or extraordinary resources, only ingenuity and knowledge of basic naval carpentry. But its impact was devastating because it exploited a fundamental weakness of large fleets, their difficulty in maneuvering quickly. Once the vanguard ships were immobilized or damaged, the entire fleet was compromised. It was like knocking down the first domino in a long row. The use of fire as a weapon also demonstrated Dionysius's profound understanding of psychological warfare. Fire has always been one of nature's most terrifying forces, and its application in naval battles was particularly devastating. Sailors, surrounded by water but unable to extinguish the flames consuming their ships, experienced primal terror. Many preferred to drown rather than burn alive, and the mere fear of fire was enough to break the morale of even the most disciplined troops. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Dionysius's plan was his understanding of human nature and military psychology. He understood that the Carthaginian commanders, confident in their numerical superiority, would be aggressive and reckless. He counted on this arrogance and exploited it perfectly. He lured them into a trap, letting them think they were winning, and then closed that trap at the exact moment when they were most vulnerable. This victory also had profound political consequences. Before the battle, Dionysius's hold on Syracuse was relatively fragile. He had come to power through questionable means, and many citizens saw him as an oppressive tyrant. But after the victory against the Carthaginians, his position became virtually impregnable. He was now the city's savior, the man who had protected Syracuse when everyone believed destruction was inevitable. His political legitimacy was cemented by the Carthaginian blood spilled in the harbor waters. Dionysius used his increased prestige to further consolidate his power. He eliminated political rivals, expanded his military forces, and launched a series of aggressive campaigns to expand Syracuse's territory. In the following decades, he would transform Syracuse into the dominant power not only of Sicily, but of much of the Western Mediterranean. His city would become synonymous with naval power and military excellence. But victory came at a price. The 700 men who fought that day would never be the same again. Many carried physical and mental scars from the battle. Some became celebrated heroes, their stories told in taverns and squares throughout Sicily. Others preferred silence, too disturbed by the memories of what they had seen and done. War, even when victorious, always leaves deep marks on those who experience it. For the Carthaginians, the defeat was a devastating blow, not only militarily, but also psychologically. Carthage prided itself on its naval power, considering itself the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. To be defeated so completely by a much smaller force shattered that illusion. It would take years for Carthage to rebuild its fleet and its confidence. And even when they did, the memory of the defeat at Syracuse would haunt them, making them more cautious and less willing to risk their fleets on daring adventures. The battle also had implications for the future development of naval warfare. The tactics employed by Dionysius, the use of coastal fortifications to support naval operations, the use of submerged barriers, and the application of incendiary weapons would be studied and adapted by naval commanders for centuries. Some military historians argue that the lessons of Syracuse even influenced naval tactics in the modern era, demonstrating that the fundamental principles of warfare remain surprisingly constant throughout the centuries. Decades after the battle, when Dionysius's hair was already grey and his body marked by time and countless campaigns, he still remembered that day as the defining moment of his life. In conversations with his closest advisors, he admitted that success had not been guaranteed. There were moments during the battle when everything could have fallen apart, when a single miscalculation could have turned victory into catastrophe. But luck, combined with meticulous preparation, had favored Syracuse. The 700 men who defended the port that day became legendary. Their stories were passed down from generation to generation, each time embellished and heroic. Fathers told their children about the courage of those warriors, about how they had faced impossible odds and triumphed through cunning and bravery. Poets composed verses about the battle, comparing the defenders of Syracuse to the heroes of Troy and Marathon. Sculptors immortalized their exploits in marble and bronze. But beyond mythology and propaganda, the Battle of Syracuse represented something profoundly important in military history. It demonstrated that victory in war is not determined solely by numbers or resources, but by leadership, strategy, and the ability to adapt to circumstances. Dionysius had understood that he could not defeat the Carthaginians on their own terms, so he created entirely new terms that favored his smaller but more agile and better commanded forces. The battle also revealed the critical importance of local knowledge. Dionysius knew the waters around Syracuse intimately. He knew where the currents were strongest, where the winds blew most favorably, where hidden reefs and sandbanks could be used as weapons. The Carthaginians, on the other hand, were fighting in unfamiliar territory, navigating waters they didn't know, relying on maps that didn't capture all the subtle but crucial nuances of the environment. This difference in knowledge was as important as any difference in weaponry or troop numbers. In the years following the battle, Dionysius continued to refine his naval tactics. He invested heavily in military research and development, hiring the best engineers and inventors in the Mediterranean world. Under his patronage, new siege weapons, new ship designs, and new tactical formations were developed. Syracuse became a center of military innovation, attracting mercenaries, adventurers, and scholars from all over the known world. Carthage, for its part, learned its own lessons from the defeat. They never again underestimated the Greeks of Sicily. Their subsequent military expeditions were planned with much more care, with extensive reconnaissance and meticulous preparation. They studied Dionysius' tactics, seeking ways to neutralize his advantages. The rivalry between Syracuse and Carthage would continue for generations, with each side pushing the other to innovate and improve. Ironically, Dionysius's victory may have indirectly contributed to his eventual downfall. Military success made him increasingly arrogant and autocratic. He began to believe his own propaganda, thinking himself invincible and infallible. His final years were marked by growing paranoia, brutal political persecutions, and increasingly erratic policies. The man who had saved Syracuse also nearly destroyed it through his own tyranny. But this does not diminish the magnitude of their achievement on that decisive day in 396 BC. The victory of the 700 Greeks against the Carthaginian armada remains one of the most impressive triumphs in ancient military history. It was a victory that demonstrated the power of strategic thinking over brute force, of preparation over improvisation, of intelligence over numbers. For modern scholars, the battle offers lessons that remain relevant. In a world where conflicts often seem to be determined by who possesses more resources or more advanced technology, Syracuse reminds us that creativity, adaptability, and effective leadership can overcome even the greatest disadvantages. Dionysius did not have more ships or more men than his enemies, but he had a better plan and the determination to execute it perfectly. The battle also highlights the importance of morale and motivation. The 700 Greeks fought for their homes, their families, their freedom. The Carthaginians fought for conquest and glory. This difference in motivation translated into differences in performance on the battlefield. The Greeks were willing to take greater risks, to fight more fiercely, to persevere against more terrible odds, because they knew there was no alternative to victory. Furthermore, the battle demonstrates the value of terrain and geography in warfare. Dionysius transformed the sea itself into a weapon, using the natural features of the port of Syracuse to create tactical advantages that compensated for his numerical inferiority. This principle of using the natural environment as a force multiplier would be applied in countless battles throughout history, from Thermopylae to Stalingrad. Today, when we visit the ruins of Syracuse, we can still see the remains of the ancient fortifications that flanked the harbor. We can imagine the walls covered with archers, the flames reflecting on the water, the battle cries echoing over the waves. The stones do not speak, but they hold the memory of that extraordinary day when 700 men became immortal. The story of the defense of Syracuse teaches us that the impossible is sometimes merely improbable. That defeat can be transformed into victory through careful planning and courageous execution. That visionary leaders can change the course of history, not through supernatural powers, but through clear thinking and unwavering determination. and that small groups of determined people fighting for something they truly believe in can accomplish feats that future generations will consider miraculous. Dionysius' naval trap was not merely a military victory. It was a demonstration of humanity's potential for tactical ingenuity, for courage under extreme pressure, and for the ability to transform seemingly insurmountable disadvantages into decisive advantages. It was, in essence, a triumph of the human spirit over adverse circumstances. And so, more than 2,000 years later, we still tell this story. We still marvel at Dionysius's cunning, at the courage of the 700 defenders, at the dramatic turnaround that transformed a seemingly certain defeat into an overwhelming victory. Because stories like this remind us of what we are capable of when challenged, when cornered, when all seems lost. They inspire us to believe that we can overcome our own impossible challenges, whatever they may be. The Battle of Syracuse remains timeless, not just as a historical event, but as an enduring symbol of how intelligence, preparation, and courage can triumph against all odds. It is a lesson that resonates through the centuries and will continue to inspire future generations of leaders, strategists, and all those who face their own moments of seemingly insurmountable adversity. When the last Carthaginian ship disappeared over the horizon on that fateful afternoon, the defenders of Syracuse finally allowed exhaustion to take hold of their bodies. Men fell to their knees on the decks of their ships, some weeping with relief, others simply staring blankly at the blood-stained sea, trying to process what they had just experienced. They had faced death and won. Against all odds, against all military logic, they had survived. Dionysius descended from the walls and walked to the harbor where his men were beginning to return. He didn't make any grand speeches at that moment. There was no need. He simply walked among his warriors, placing a hand on the shoulder of one here, exchanging meaningful glances with another there. These men had trusted him, had followed his seemingly crazy plan, and he had led them to victory. It was a bond that transcended words. The story of the defense of Syracuse reminds us that the great moments in history aren't just about numbers on maps or army movements. They're about people, real people with fears, hopes, and dreams. The 700 men who defended Syracuse weren't superheroes. They were fishermen, merchants, artisans, and farmers who took up arms because their city needed them. And when the moment came, when everything was at stake, they didn't fail. This battle also teaches us about the true meaning of leadership. Dionysius could have chosen the easy way out, surrendering the city, negotiating terms of surrender, saving his own life. But he chose to fight. More importantly, he chose to fight intelligently, using his intellect as a weapon, as powerful as any sword or spear. He proved that a leader doesn't need to be the strongest warrior or the bravest man, but the wisest, the most prepared, and the most committed to victory. In the calm waters of Syracuse harbor, as the moon rose over the battle wreckage, something fundamental had changed. A small city-state had defeated one of the greatest powers of the Mediterranean world. The message was clear: size does not determine destiny. Victory belongs to those who think most clearly, plan most carefully, and execute most brilliantly. The 700 Greeks of Syracuse entered eternity that day. Their names may have been forgotten by history, but their feat never will be. They are a perpetual reminder that, even in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, human courage combined with strategic intelligence can achieve the impossible. And so ends the story of Dionysius' naval trap, not merely as an ancient battle tale, but as an eternal inspiration for all those who face insurmountable challenges. May we, when our time comes to face our own stormy seas, possess the wisdom of Dionysius, the courage of the 700, and the determination of Syracuse. For in the end, history teaches us that it is not the largest armies that win, but the indomitable spirits who refuse to accept defeat.